And welcome to this week's episode of Making It in Asheville. We are joined by Tim Gormley, who has his hands in many things in Asheville. The primary, or what you might have seen or heard him from, is Burial Beer. We'll get into all of the other projects in this episode. But Tim, thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting. I love what you guys are doing, and as I'm sure we'll get into more as we chat, just like I'm very passionate about the kind of stories that come with just people and businesses and projects and art and all that stuff. So I love that you guys kind of have dedicated yourselves to telling those stories. So it's truly an honor to be a part of it.
Oh, wow. Well, I thank you. We appreciate it. And I think that what has me excited about today's episode, not unlike some of our past guests, but it seems like you are doing, I'll say, just a lot. And it seems to be very like curious, meaning you're following interests, and sometimes it leads into a different direction than what the obvious or like next step in a progression might be. And I don't know if I'm making this up, but I look over your shoulder, I see books on Amaro and vermouth, and that's not beer. Like, that's beer adjacent. It's maybe alcohol. And then you have Forestry Camp hat on, but I'm thinking Burial Beer. Forestry Camp is like this incredible experience just like south of downtown. And so before we get into, I guess, the businesses that you're running and what you're doing here in Asheville, what was like the childhood like of this curious mind that now has a bunch of businesses and makes a ton of at least beverages, but I'm sure other things too.
Yeah, sure. Oh man, where to begin? Well, yeah, I can try to give you a little bit of the arc of my life without getting too detailed. But essentially, I grew up in Southeastern Pennsylvania, Delaware County. Kind of a suburb of Philadelphia.
Yeah, just for S's and G's, because I went to school in Southeastern Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a tiny little town called Glen Mills, which is in Downing. Well, technically, I was born in Downingtown. Yeah, but I mostly grew up in Glen Mills, and I went to high school in Westchester.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Small world.
I basically grew up, on a couple acres in the woods, and so spent a lot of my youth just kind of like exploring the woods, and then got really into, as I grew up, got really into sports, played soccer really, really seriously. I was on like a kind of Premier League, what they called it. It was one of the best teams in all of Pennsylvania. We got to travel all over, actually the world. Went to Brazil at one point to play soccer, so that was pretty cool. My dad has had a variety of jobs in his life, but I feel like in my formative years, he was cooking at a French restaurant. So he doesn't really consider himself a chef or anything like that, but definitely grew up with a lot of kind of creativity in the kitchen.
Wow.
Which I think definitely has, affected me in some subconscious ways. Ended up going to college at Penn State. Spent all 4 years at main campus in State College, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Honestly, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up,
Yeah.
And so I was always a pretty good student. Math and science was kind of what I was most interested in. So I ended up deciding to go to college, or at least my initial major was electrical engineering. And so I got really, really into music, not so much as a musician. I guess for whatever reason, sports kind of dominated. And so I never really took on an instrument, but just was a hugely into music, just as like a listener, and loved kind of, the punk rock DIY scene, was really into metal, very various. I mean, I have a very diverse ear for music, but definitely spent like any chance I got once I got my driver's license, I was driving into Philly to go to shows.
And there's a great scene in Philadelphia for music.
Have you ever been to the First Unitarian Church in Philly?
But it's yes, I've heard of it. I know that all of my friends, most of my Philly friends, are in bands or have been in bands, and that place, they say, was like formative and the most amazing and most important place that they would go for shows.
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't even tell you the number of shows that I probably went to there. And, it was, that was pretty kind of critical. So anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that, my thought with this electrical engineering thing was that I could kind of apply some of my interests in math and science to something that could be potentially used in the music field. So my idea was to kind of become like an audio engineer or something like that. As it turned out, in my first couple of years of college, I didn't do a very good job of paying attention to school. And so I didn't have the best grades. And so I kind of reached a point where I needed to pivot a little bit. And at that point, it just kind of made the most sense for me to shift into business, a business degree. So I ended up graduating with a degree in business logistics, or like supply chain management, which is, it's kind of funny when I think about it, because I often, when people ask me what my degree is in, I almost like answer it with a little bit of embarrassment, even though like I own a business now, and it's certainly helpful. It just, when I was growing up, being in this kind of punk rock scene, like going to school for business felt like
and logistics.
The thing I would do. And I think that's notable, because I think even to this day, as a business owner, if it wasn't for my business partners, Doug and Jess, I don't think that I would be nearly as successful, because like, in a lot of ways, I kind of like shy away from the business side of it. And I treat it much more like an outlet for like artistic expression. So I'm very, very thankful to have Doug and Jess in my life, who are just incredible at kind of running the business side, and like kind of letting me do my thing, but also reining me in at times. And it's a really beautiful kind of yin and yang relationship that we have. But anyway,
so I think that's perfect, right? So you, to try and recap and restate, first of all, I think that there's this incredible, I'll call it correlation, but it might be causation, in my own life, of people who grew up loving punk rock and the punk rock scene and like hardcore music are incredibly interesting and do cool things. It's at least in my own experience, I've noticed that. And I'm not sure what it is about it, other than, my attempt is that they saw people just creating a thing, and creating is a good thing to do. It seems to me.
No, I think you're totally right. And I think that one of the things that so much drew me to those music scenes was like, it's kind of like this subculture of people, right? And there's a deep level of camaraderie that comes with loving something that's kind of like on the peripherals of society, and it's like a fairly small, it's a niche group. And I think that, I often think about how similar craft beer is to that. I mean, nowadays, craft beer isn't nearly as niche as it was when I first got into it, 20 years ago. But it still is like very much a subculture, and there's so many relationships that come out of you're into craft beer or you make beer. We immediately have something in common that not everyone does have in common, and I think that also relates to Asheville. I feel like part of what drew me to Asheville was that same sort of concept. It's a small little artsy community, and that's it's a beautiful thing. And I feel like even though there's so many, obviously there's a huge diversity of interests and artistic expressions and whatever in Asheville, but I do still feel like there's a lot of camaraderie here of just being like, we've made a conscious decision to live in Asheville, where there's really no industry.
Yeah.
So why was that? And we have something in common by making that decision.
I love it. I think that you're onto something. That is a beautiful way to take the thought. And so, yes, I agree. I think that the otherness makes us alike, right? Like the fact that we've all chosen to be here is at the very least we have that. And so it makes for, I think, easier friendships and easier community building. And at least what we've experienced is like the benefit of the doubt. Like, hey, you've chosen to be here. I guess it's because you want to help the place, leave it better than you found it. And so how long ago did you move to Asheville from Southeastern PA, State College, Pennsylvania? Like, maybe just like the landmarks that happened on the way, and how long after did Burial start?
So yeah, the way the timeline kind of goes, I graduated college in 2003. I moved into Philly. I worked at a produce company, one of the biggest produce companies in the U.S., kind of as a shipping manager. And actually,
that logistics degree.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But working with produce every day was actually really enlightening. I mean, we sold all sorts of interesting produce, fruits, vegetables, things that I honestly wasn't even aware existed, and so that really started to, I think, another one of those kind of subconscious things of walking down this path of kind of utilizing unique ingredients. Anyway, I was working at this produce company. I was managing all these, inner city guys, every color of human being, every type of background. And, at that time, and probably still today, Philly was a pretty dangerous place to live. And
what neighborhood were you in?
I lived in Northern Liberties.
Right on, yeah, cool.
Which was pretty great.
Actually, no, at least Fishtown. Fishtown. I was going to say,
came to me.
Yeah, so my buddies are in Fishtown.
Between Kensington and Northern Liberty. Yeah, Fishtown. That's what it's called.
Yeah, so I don't know what it was like in early or mid 2000s, but in 2020, awesome. What a cool little part of town.
Yeah, when I was there, it was definitely on the rise.
Yeah.
I lived like one block behind Johnny Brenda's.
For sure. Cool.
Cool.
All right.
Venue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, everyone who doesn't know Pennsylvania or Philly's like, what's happening?
Right.
But Philly is a cool little town. I think so. I think that in the realm of cities, Philly, like Asheville to me, so far has been a town that gets the respect of a city, though, just in terms of total population, hard to argue that this is like a city, right? But it's part of the conversation of American cities, which is amazing. Yeah. I think that Philly does a really interesting thing. At least I haven't been to, the Chicagos, but like its little neighborhoods feel like tiny cities in their own right. And there's this like sprawl that happens, but it's not an LA sprawl and it's not a Houston sprawl, because it still feels like one place. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm really into city as like a middle city, or Philly as a middle city, where New York is just overwhelming.
Right.
And then all of a sudden Philly and Fishtown has like parts that are, to me, like Asheville community, but still it's millions of people. So it's a totally different scale.
Oh yeah. Yeah. My relationship with Philly is, I think it's such that I didn't really realize what I had until I left.
Yeah.
I think, while I was living there, I was really involved in the kind of the art scene and the music scene. And, I was actually dating a woman that went to art school, and when she graduated, and actually my younger sister had just graduated from college, and I was working with all these kind of inner city guys that were always telling me all these stories, terrible stories about things that were happening to them and their families, drive-bys on their house. Like it just, all these kind of things culminated in me really feeling like I needed to get out of there.
Yeah.
And so this girl I was dating at the time felt like she would have some more opportunity in the art world on the West Coast. And so we kind of like took this 2-week vacation where we flew into Seattle, and then took trains down to Portland and San Francisco. And it was like we were going to decide what city we wanted to move to amongst those three. Mm-hmm. And we decided to move to Seattle. And actually, I just kind of like pitched the idea to my sister, kind of half jokingly, like, "Hey, you want to move to Seattle with me?" And she was like, "Okay." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And so the three of us drove out to Seattle. I pretty much, got rid of all of my possessions. Anything that fit in the car was what went. And I think kind of a notable part of that part of the story is that my mom actually got me a Mr. Beer kit as a graduation present from college.
Wow.
She knew that I was really into beer. I really got into beer in my college years. And so
it's one thing to drink a lot of beer in college years, right? Like I think that's we'll call it common in the like American big university state college, right? Penn State. That's common. It's another thing to then say, well, like when you say into beer, right? The macro brewery thing was, probably even more pronounced than today. Micros, I don't know what it looked like in early 2000s. I've read a couple of books, but I don't know what it was like in Pennsylvania. Like if you were drinking Dogfish Head, was that like the cool beer then? I don't even know.
Well, yeah, for sure. Dogfish Head is incredibly influential to me. I was definitely drinking, like everyone, pretty much everyone, or at least of that generation that starts drinking beer, in high school. You're drinking the cheapest thing you can get, basically. Yeah. And, I was drinking a lot of like Rolling Rock, which at the time was being made in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Sure, yeah. Some Yingling here and there, another classic of Pennsylvania. But when I was in college, there was this little kind of like pool hall thing that had an adjoining kind of bottle shop. Mm-hmm. And I found myself going there once I was 21. And this bottle shop had this kind of like build your own 6-pack sort of thing.
Cool.
And it was the first time I'd ever seen that in my life. I didn't even know that was a thing. So I just started to like grab these bottles off the shelf that looked interesting, and just found myself, exploring what was out there. And the kind of one of those like common questions that gets asked to a lot of brewers is like, what was your Epiphany beer or whatever, the beer you drank that changed everything for you. And for me, it was some of the beers from Samuel Smith, which is from Tadcaster in the UK. And it was probably the Imperial Stout that really kind of blew my mind. And And then that just kind of sent me on a journey of trying lots of different beers. And it's kind of funny to think now, I mean, the world of beer has changed so dramatically since then. I mean, I was just thinking about how there was this thing, I think they called it like the first name club or something like that. But this was basically like this group of American brewers that were basically as famous as could be in the beer world. And it was like people that you could just say their first name in a conversation about craft beer and people would know exactly who you're talking about. Wow. And this was like Adam Avery from Avery Brewing. This was Tommy Arthur from Lost Abbey and Port Brewing. This was Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River. This was Sam Calagione from Dogfish Head, Rob Todd from Allagash. Like these were names that, like, if you were into beer, you knew their names off the top of your head. And now, with, I don't know, 8,000 plus breweries, I can't even keep up at this point. And there's just like, I think there's still maybe a few kind of iconic, like modern day iconic brands out there, but I mean, I felt like at one point I probably had at least heard of like 90% of the breweries in the US. Yeah. And now I haven't heard of, 90% Yeah. So, it's kind of crazy to think about that, but
and so that makes me want to ask a question, and I'll hold the question until just to connect the dots. So Portland for, I'll guess, a number of years, and then you probably drove to Asheville, if I'm guessing.
I actually lived in Seattle.
Seattle
for 5 years. Okay. And that's kind of where I started to brew professionally.
Okay.
So it was 2009 was when I first got a job at a brewery and just kind of started out working there weekends only, kind of kept my day job. Mm-hmm. Worked there on weekends, cleaning kegs, cleaning the brew house, doing whatever menial jobs needed to be done. And then just kind of slowly learned on the job, really, how to brew on a big scale. And it was actually kind of subsequent to that where I felt like, okay, I'm starting to brew professionally and I haven't homebrewed in like years. So I need to get back into that. And it was right around the same time that I met my current business partners, Doug and Jess Reeser. So Doug is originally from Ohio, kind of like the suburbs of Cleveland. Jess grew up in Brooklyn, New York, but they both found themselves out in Seattle. And that's where we met. And when I first met them, they were not really that into beer. They were kind of into wine more than anything. And I kind of got them into beer, I guess.
With just enthusiasm and repetitions. You're like, you got to taste this one. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, I think that, Doug often tells the story of how Russian River, Pliny the Elder was kind of like his Epiphany Beer, if you will. And I still remember the moment that we went to the bar and got that beer. And, that was a very iconic beer. I mean, it still kind of is in some facets of the craft beer scene, a very iconic beer. And so anyway, Doug and I started to homebrew a lot. And then I ended up having a spell where I was working part-time at the brewery, part-time at a homebrew shop. Then Doug, Jess, and I started writing this beer blog together. So we were kind of documenting our travels. At that point in our lives, it was like anywhere we traveled, it was like first thing you look up is what breweries are we going to go to. And so, we tell our experiences at tap rooms, and we do like beer reviews and current events and all that stuff.
Did it get traction? Like, did people start reading?
I think so. we were pretty ambitious about it, and between the three of us, we were trying to put out like 3, 4, 5 posts a week.
Wow, right on.
It was like a pretty
media.
big,
That's a media company.
yeah. It was pretty intense there, and actually, it was really like through writing that blog, and partially through kind of being involved as a brewer and all that home brewing a lot. It was really when we just started to make a lot of connections in the beer scene in Seattle. And, we would go into bars or breweries and, people kind of like knew who we were. And so we got to kind of feel that was the first time we really got to feel the camaraderie of the craft beer scene. Yeah. And it was really through that we, and of course, the general love of beer and enjoying brewing beer and feeling like we were brewing some cool beers, and just all these things kind of coalesced into a thing where it was like, okay, if we don't start our own brewery someday, I think we'll regret it forever. So we really just kind of started to chip away at a business plan while we were in Seattle. Doug was an attorney at the time. And Jess was working for some nonprofits, and she has a background in art. She has like a master's degree in arts administration. So we kind of felt like we had a good, the 3 legs to a table. It was like we had that kind of law side. Doug started his own practice, so he had experience starting a business. I had the kind of production side of things, and Jess was really good kind of administrative, but also like had a really great eye for art and design and stuff like that. So we eventually decided kind of collectively that we didn't want to start the business in Seattle, and there was a few different factors there. Part of it was that Doug and Jess had their firstborn son, Axel, in Seattle. They knew they wanted to have 2 kids. All their family was back east, so they kind of wanted to be closer to family. And then for me, I ended up getting this my kind of like dream job out there in Seattle was to work for this brewery called Sound Brewery, which they were making very kind of like true to style Belgian and German beers, which at the time and still to this day are like the styles I'm most passionate about. And they were doing them really well, and they were winning awards for them. And so I sought out this job, and I got the job, and I started brewing there, and I was pretty much brewing every batch of beer there, and we were continuing to win awards. And I would often tell people that asked that I worked at Sound Brewery as a brewer, and a lot of people, more often than not, people were like, never heard of it. And to me, that was a sign. It felt telling that it was very hard to stand out in that market. Seattle not only has a great scene of its own, but it has access to the whole West Coast, and the West Coast is, at least at that time, was just kind of like mostly dominating the craft beer scene. Sure. So that was kind of it for me. I loved Seattle, and I miss it every day, but it in a lot of ways, it kind of was a business decision for me to leave. And so I had a friend that went to college at UNC Asheville that I had visited, and so that was kind of my introduction to Asheville. And it definitely had a great beer scene. That was, back when Asheville was kind of like perennially the beer city USA or whatever. Wow. So it had a good scene, and it had a lot of what I loved about Seattle from like a outdoorsy perspective. And it definitely, like I mentioned earlier, had that kind of like artsy, and something about it felt really comfortable. Sure. So I kind of pitched the idea to Doug and Jess to move to Asheville. They came to visit. They fell in love with it. They were like, this is it. We're moving here. And
what year about is this? 2000?
Well, we arrived in Asheville like September, October of 2012.
2012. Wow.
So yeah, I was in Seattle for 5 years.
And,
Um,
I'm interested. So, and the entire time as you're moving to Asheville, it's like we're moving to open a brewery,
right. Yeah.
right? And
Exactly.
so Seattle, much bigger city,
Yeah.
hard, even while winning awards, to break through the noise and be a important brewery in town. In a smaller town that's considered Beer City, USA, what was the logic that, like, yeah, we'll come in and we'll disrupt this thing, like we'll do our own thing, like there's room for us. How did you what can you remember to 2012 and the thoughts of, like, yes, there's room for us still?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that's often kind of it feels contradictory to say we left Seattle because it was too competitive and then we moved to Beer City, USA to open for it. It totally doesn't make sense. And I think part of it was that despite having this great scene here, we felt like there really wasn't a lot of breweries here that were like stepping outside of the box that was the beer scene at that time. Like the beer scene at that time felt like it was, you go to a brewery and you got that full spectrum. You've got the light beer through the stout, and you've got, an amber ale, and you've got a pale ale, and you've got an IPA, and you've got, maybe a wheat beer of some kind. And that was like that was the program. That was how you did it. And we really had ambitions to do something a little bit different, to make more like Belgian inspired beers. I think really that was the thing. So in 2010, Doug, Jess, and I went on kind of like a vision quest of sorts to Europe. This was after we had decided to start the brewery. We were kind of just like looking for inspiration. We wanted to have that experience. We were always at least I was always incredibly interested, like I said, in Belgian and German beers. So we went to Europe. We went to Belgium. We went to Netherlands. We went to Germany. We went to France, and we just drank our way through it all, and went to as many of those iconic places. And it was really the concept of farmhouse brewing was and still is, in my opinion, like the most beautiful romantic concept in beer. And it's, this idea of people farming the land and making beer, using ingredients that are available to them on the farm, and brewing seasonally. And that concept really resonated really with all three of us. And so when we got to Asheville and we started to look for property, look for a place for the brewery, our initial concept was to kind of do a farmhouse inspired brewery. So we were looking kind of on the outskirts of town. We were looking at, larger pieces of land. And we kind of quickly realized that brewing outside of city limits has a lot of challenges. Water is like one of the most important parts of making beer. And, if you're going to brew in any reasonable capacity, you're going to need a lot of access to water. So if you're outside of the city, and you're having to drill wells and stuff like that, which can be extremely expensive, you're having to figure out what to do with all your wastewater. And, if you're on a septic system, that can be incredibly challenging. And then there's the matter of getting raw materials out there. Can a 16-wheeler get to this property? Like there's so many little things like that kind of quickly became obvious that maybe this was biting off more than we could chew at the time. So we just eventually started looking, kind of changing our concept a little bit as far as a space goes. And then we ended up finding the space in the south, or what is now called the South Slope. At the time, I don't even know if that neighborhood had a name. But yeah, basically right where our tap room is now, at 40 Collier Avenue. That was the space that we initially found. And actually, we signed the lease. So we were renting it initially. We signed the lease for, the first of the year of 2013. So we're talking, like a matter of months after we arrived to Asheville, we signed a lease. So that was kind of crazy. It happened pretty quickly. And
so there's a million questions, because that space is formative for Sarah and I. Like when we first visited Asheville, we walked everywhere on the first trip that we could get to, and we got to places that most people don't walk to. We went all the way down to like the Foundation area and Summit coffee roasters on foot because we're like, well, let's see what this place is about. And so anyway, we put it in park at Burial in South Slope, and just like there was a moment where we looked at each other like, this is a great way to spend a Friday afternoon or a Saturday afternoon. I don't remember the day exactly. And so from 2013, putting signing a paper that says this is a thing, we have to start, like rent is due, to being I'll call it a tourist destination and a local destination, where it's like when people come to town, we go to Burial and South Slope because that's like an incredible representation of like the energy that I think is here. But like there's so much that exists in the brand that is Burial Beer to me. I wonder how that process started, right? So now you show up in the South Slope location, and I want to say it's Tom Selleck. It's one of the greatest mustachioed man of all time. But there's this giant Tom Selleck mural. You go to forestry camp, and it's like you're walking into a movie set. Like it's so well done. And I'm wondering, did it start like that, or was it just a warehouse with a couple of taps, drilled through a wall, and it happens over time? We're in it now, so let's look at that transition from 2013. The ink is now drying on a document that says we exist and this is our location, to today.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's hard to really explain, I guess, because we've just kind of allowed it to evolve, and we've always tried to be very true to ourselves and to kind of follow our passions. And I think that's been such a critical part of our success, is to, allow the business to be kind of flexible in how, I think there is certainly like a brand, that we try to stay consistent to. Though admittedly, it did take us a few years before we really even like solidified what that brand was.
Were you always called Burial Beer?
Yeah, we were always called Burial Beer. And I think that that's a pretty cool, important part of the story. Jess, it was actually Jess's idea initially to call it Burial. And so Doug and Jess went to grad school in New Orleans. So before they moved to Seattle, where I met them, they were down in New Orleans. And New Orleans is just, one of the coolest, most unique cities in the world, without a doubt. And it just has such a specific culture to it. And so because of the fact that New Orleans is below sea level, if you were to go to like a cemetery, it looks very different than cemeteries almost anywhere else, because there's all these like above ground tombs because it's below sea level.
Yeah.
Um, and also there's this beautiful concept that they have there called the jazz funeral. So it's like if somebody passes away, instead of being this very mournful thing, they decide to kind of like flip it and celebrate the life of the person that passed. So they basically parade around the streets with the whole second line thing, and they've got horns and they've got drums, and members of the community that might not even know the person that passed away just kind of join in on the parade. And I don't know, it almost makes me emotional to think about, because it's just such a cool view of life and death. And so that concept is what burial represents to us. And I think we tie it back a lot to what I was saying about the farmhouse brewing tradition, and this idea of like seasonality, and crops grow and they die every year, and there's this renewal as the dead crops break down, and it feeds the soil, and like there's just so many things. And the process of brewing a beer there's a lot of kind of cyclical things that you can insert into the concept of brewing. So, and then me being really into metal music pretty much my whole life, burial kind of resonated with me there. And so it was when we came up with like what the imagery it was going to be like. For me, it always had to be like this kind of concert poster, like album cover thing.
Yeah. And
so, I reached out to a couple different artists that I personally loved from that world. And thankfully we were able to, start to work with David Paul Seymour, who has more or less from day one been our illustrator.
Wow.
And so obviously, the burial cans, bottles, posters, all that stuff, wouldn't be as iconic, I guess, if it wasn't for David and our relationship.
That's amazing. And I think iconic is the right word. I mean, every bottle I've ever seen is a work of art, and the skeletons and the Reaper skeletons are awesome. And it's so it's hard to put the right words on it, but one of the things that's coming up for me is that I wonder if it's because you did an exceptional job telling me the story of the brand's name and idea. And I wonder if it's because you're able to tell the story of the brand's name and idea that there is such a cohesive look and feel that I've experienced as a consumer. Or if it's because there's such a cohesive look and feel, you're able to tell the story. I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, but the outcome is the same, is that as a consumer, the story you just told makes a ton of sense and fills in some of the holes, because my mind sees a skeleton playing trumpets at times. And, so there's this celebration energy while it's, morose potentially. And like the name points to burial. How fun.
Yeah, a lot of our kind of like core brands, we developed this concept of the light side and the dark side. Mm-hmm. So, our one-off beers, a lot of the beers that you see in 16-ounce cans and bottles and stuff like that don't really utilize that concept. But this was something that was very, very much a part of who we were when we first started to package beer. And it was basically every can would have 2 unique illustrations on it. And that was, almost unheard of anyone doing that. It basically, there was a lot more kind of cost that went into it. Basically, I had to have 2 pieces of art for every individual SKU, what I mean? But it was this really cool concept that we loved of kind of telling that story of life and death and the light side and the dark side. So one side, even though at the end of the day it was all illustrated by David Paul Seymour, who's pretty fucking metal, there was, you could tell which side was the light side and the dark side, even though they might both have skulls in it. There was kind of like a more intensity to the dark side and a little bit more like, I don't know what the right word would be, but it was a little bit softer. And so
I love that.
Yeah.
How about with names of beers? Like what was the first beer you went to market with? Does it have an important name? I feel like beer names are sometimes, make or break. But maybe it's just as an outsider, and I am a sucker for puns. So I find that beers often are, puns are baked right into them, and I tend to love that. But what was the first beer you went to market with?
Well, that is kind of an interesting part of the story as well, because as it pertains back to this concept that we had of, or at least a desire that we had of being this kind of farmhouse brewery, we were initially trying to name all of our beers after tools, or in some cases kind of like weapons, because you think about this idea of like a scythe or a pitchfork or something like that like obviously innately is meant to be used as a tool on the farm, but also through the years has been used as weapons, which is kind of an interesting, again, getting back to that kind of light side, dark side concept. But anyway, our tap handles were all tools when we first opened. We had tools screwed onto the wall all over the place. It kind of felt like you were walking into some like in a scene of a horror movie when Jason is like chasing somebody and they end up going into a old barn and there's like scythes hanging and you're like, oh, that scythe's definitely going to kill that person. And that was kind of the feel that it had. And so we tried to name all of our beers after tools, and Scythe was our rye pale ale. Pitchfork was like a kind of an amber saison that we did. Skillet was one of our first beers, even though it's kind of a tool of the kitchen, I guess you could say. At some point we had to take some pretty dramatic liberties because we were running out of tools, and our plan had always been to just kind of stay creative, constantly make new beers, not just rely on the same kind of core beers all the time. So we were pretty prolific and still are with our brewing of new, unique recipes. So we kind of reached a point where we're like, okay, we have to change our plan as far as how we name these beers. It's just becoming too ridiculous. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, part of the reason why beer names are so unique is perhaps that they have to be, right, to be defensible in some way, or is it, am I looking? You have a lawyer as a partner, so I imagine you've thought this through. But is that part of it?
Oh,
right, you can't have the same name.
Yeah, that's kind of actually the boring part of the story, is that we kind of quickly realized that within the beer segment, we are also lumped in with like wine and in some cases spirits and lots of other beverages. So the bank of available names becomes pretty small because of obviously there's just hundreds of thousands of products out there. And of course not all of them are trademarked, but there is a certain level of respect that you have to have for other businesses' products. And, you have to kind of look at yourself and be like, would I be upset if somebody named their beer Scythe? Like probably. Yeah. So I don't want to do that to them. So Doug, in his, lawyer mind was like, if we create names that are borderline sentences or fragments, of a sentence, then it kind of becomes like literally we couldn't, if we wanted to, trademark some of these names. They're like too complicated.
Right.
And so it just becomes this thing where it's like the chances are dramatically smaller for somebody to, accidentally name their product a sentence that we came up with. And, another kind of factor that came into play there was Jess and her kind of art background. She's always been very much interested in some of the kind of like Flemish Renaissance art. And so some of these, like Hieronymus Bosch is like a really good example. Like some of these paintings we found to be really, really inspirational because they're like super like psychedelic and like damaged and weird. And it felt in a lot of ways like in line with what we were trying to create as an imagery thing. And so there was a kind of a period of time there where we started naming our beers after these old paintings that we really loved. And it's one of those like statute of limitations things where these paintings are so old that it's like free use at this point.
Wow.
And so that was a really fun time. Like David would basically look at the painting that the beer was named after and do his own interpretation of the painting. And a lot of really cool things came out of that. And we still, to this day, release some of those beers. Like Death and the Miser is a good example. Fall of the Rebel Angels, Garden of Earthly Delights. So that kind of led us to the path that we're on right now, of like kind of coming up with names that I guess could sound like they were an old Renaissance painting.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And they definitely have like some sort of metalness to them, I guess. But as Doug likes to say, they're very introspective. A lot of the names that Doug comes up with, which at this point is honestly a vast majority of them, he'll tell you that they come from experiences that he's had and challenges and stresses that he's had in his life. And so I think that all ties back into, to get kind of like businessy to some degree, is that we have what we call a niche as our business, or I guess you could potentially even call it like a mission statement of sorts, to create immersive experiences. And that's our goal as a business, in all of the facets of our business. And I think that maybe on its surface seems like it's the experience of going to the tap room and seeing the mural and sitting outside and drinking the beer, and maybe chatting with somebody that you've never talked to before that you're sitting next to, and the music that's playing. And all that is definitely important, and we pay attention to it. And but also, you can have a totally immersive experience with our beer at home on your sofa, and that's like the art on the can, and that's the copy on the can, and that's the name of the beer, and that's the obviously the sensory experience that comes with that. And we always have hoped that people kind of look a little bit deeper into like what's going on here.
Yeah.
Like, why is this beer called that? Why what does this art represent? How does it tie back to the beer? Because we do really try to be intentional about all that. And there is a story pretty much always there. And it's so, this is one of the biggest challenges that I face in the business, is finding the outlet to tell those stories, because like this right here is one of my favorite things to do, because I actually get to kind of like tell the story. But in the world of modern, social media, and stuff like that, where so much data is hitting you all the time, it can be hard to like find space to really tell those stories. So you have to be kind of I don't know, a little vague, I guess, and just hope that it intrigues people enough to like look deeper or ask the questions.
I absolutely love that. And I think that as a consumer, again, we've experienced that and we have asked the question. So congrats. Well done. Mission accomplished. With, and again, this is, Sarah and I moved to Asheville 2019. So you're at least 6 years into your business by the time we show up. Were there moments along the way that you might identify as mile markers, where you're like, okay, we didn't lose that much money this month, or, like, okay, we've had our 1,000th customer. Okay, we opened a new location. Okay, we have outkicked our capacity to brew. We're empty. Are there kind of moments in time that you look back on as important mile markers of the last 7 years?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's so many. In the very early days, we were a 1-barrel system, which is it's 31 gallons per batch. It's a stupid business plan to start a brewery like that. But we started with our own money when we have no investors, and we didn't even have a bank loan to start the brewery, which obviously, thankfully, we were able to find success, and that's been huge for our growth. But in the early days, it was like, the biggest stress I had was running out of beer, like, all the time. And, we could only be open a couple of days a week because we literally just didn't have enough beer to be open more than that. And, when you're operating like that, if a beer doesn't turn out good and you have to dump it, it's like, I shed tears when those moments happened. It felt devastating. And then we scaled up to a 10-barrel system, really not that long after opening. And that was a really, really intense, probably still to this day, like the most intense moment of my professional career, because I felt in a lot of ways, I was like the guy in production. All the creation of the beer was on my shoulders, and scaling up these recipes tenfold and trying to, in a lot of ways, I was like hooking up the tanks by myself. And it was, I was basically living at the brewery, and that was a really intense time that really honestly changed me forever. And in a positive way, like really helped me kind of not like almost forced me to like remove a lot of stress from my life, because I felt like I was killing myself. And then so we bought the forestry camp property, and I believe it was late 2015, I want to say.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, really amazing property that was originally built by the U.S. government as it was called Forestry Camp back then, and we kept the name. It was basically built in the 30s. FDR created this program called the Civilian Conservation Corps as part of his New Deal, and it was designed to be this kind of economic stimulus. It was a combination of economic stimulus and also kind of looped into this big movement to like create national and state parks and stuff like that, preservation. And so it started in 1933. It was basically for young men between the ages of 18 and 25 to do public works. It was like building roads, building bridges, blazing trails. And the guys, there was bases, CCC bases all over the U.S. And the one here in Asheville was kind of mostly concentrating on building the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is, one of the most special things that I feel like we have here in Asheville. Passes right through town, just absolutely beautiful drive. So really cool history to it. It's 6 buildings on 2 acres. And oddly enough, we actually looked at that property when we first moved to Asheville. It was available then, and it was just way too big for us at that moment. But lo and behold, a few years later, it was still available. We bought it, and we kind of decided to approach the build out in kind of 3 stages. So the first stage was the brewery, and some storage for the brewery. And so we went from, we decided to get a 20-barrel 4-vessel brew house. So technically the brew house is only twice the size of the Collier Avenue one, which is 10-barrel. But with the 4 vessels, it's really designed to do multiple batches that kind of overlap each other. So we have mostly 60-barrel fermenters over there, a couple 20-barrel fermenters. So that moment of getting that brewery off the ground was really, really challenging for us because we had to keep making beer. So I was pretty much still brewing on Collier Avenue. So I wasn't really able to help as much with the opening of the new brewery. So we, hired a couple guys to help us out with that, and they didn't really have a ton of experience, and we kind of didn't really know what we were doing. And then, that was a huge loan that we had to take out to buy that and to get all the equipment. And like that moment was really, really, that was like our first true kind of like financial challenge where we were operating in the red for a while. And it was like extremely stressful. So that was a moment for sure, a milestone. And then another kind of big one for me. So in very early 2019, we kind of reached the like final stage of the build out of the Forestry Camp property, and that was going to be the bar and restaurant. And so we had kind of like started the construction, but honestly, no one in our organization was focusing on it. And, we needed like a project manager to like move it forward. And in a lot of ways, as it pertains to the tap room on Collier Avenue, I was always like so involved in just production of beer that I kind of felt like in some ways I missed out on being involved in the look and the feel of it. And so this opportunity with Forestry Camp, it was kind of like, we had this absolutely gorgeous historical building. And, I felt so inspired by it. And I just had all these ideas in my head of like ways to make it look and feel. But I just felt like I didn't have the bandwidth to like kind of contribute to that and to be brewing every day on top of all the other kind of things that come with owning a business. So I kind of approached Doug and Jess and I said, hey, I feel like one of us needs to focus on this. I feel very inspired. I think that we have the staff now to like take over brewing at Collier, and like, I would love to take this on. And so that was like, I have never even worked in a restaurant, let alone opened a restaurant. I was going out on a limb there, but I think Doug and Jess definitely saw the value in me doing that. And so I basically at the beginning of 2019 was like all in on getting that restaurant open. And it was, incredibly challenging for me. But also obviously very rewarding. And in some ways it was like an identity crisis thing, because everybody knew me as the head brewer of Burial. And now I had almost nothing to do with the brewing. And so, it was also a good way for me to kind of show my passion for what we were building. And I hopefully, get a lot of interest in it, at least within the beer community. Mm-hmm. And so we opened the doors late September of 2019. And, that was intensely scary and stressful, and not really knowing what I was doing, and kind of having to lean a lot on like the staff that we hired. And that was pretty intense. And then COVID hit,
That's another mile marker, I'm sure.
That goes without saying. Our restaurant was, half a year old at best.
Yeah.
And so that was really difficult for us to, we really hadn't like gotten to a comfortable place by any means with the restaurant. We were still very much like dialing it in and getting the word out about it. So that was extremely deflating for me. And I probably spent the first few months of kind of the COVID era, feeling very like having almost no inspiration. Like I felt like I wasn't contributing much at all. I was just like, put me to work. I don't really know what to do. Which was kind of challenging for me. But after doing that for a little while, kind of trying to limp by with the restaurant, we had a few kind of like close calls with COVID. We had a few members of the brew staff that were not feeling really comfortable coming into work every day. And a lot of little shifts ended up happening where essentially I needed to get back into the brewery. So I went from, not brewing, really not even touching the brewing equipment for over a year, and kind of being thrown back into the brewery by myself and trying to kind of keep up with everything. And it was a really strange time there of just trying to like get my feet back on me and like.
But my guess is that demand hasn't slowed down, right? So through the pandemic, I imagine people are drinking as much beer maybe as before, perhaps just differently. Is that wrong, right? Close?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, every business out there had to pivot in different ways, and we were no exception, and we had to change a lot of the way we operated. But, I was back at Collier, which, at that point, that brewery isn't really it's obviously not our production brewery, right? So like it's making a fairly small percent of the beer that we're making. Mm-hmm. But it was, at that time, it had really kind of shifted into being our imperial stout, like brewery. It was like, we basically dedicated 3 of our tanks to making imperial stouts. And we were trying to put out a new imperial stout every single week. And these are, heavily adjuncted beers that are like 15% ABV. And they're like, amongst the hardest beers to make that we make. And so that was pretty intense for me. But eventually, like riding a bike, of course, it came back to me. And it was actually really wonderful for me to kind of get back to the roots there. And not like a lot of time went by, but it was enough to, and my whole headspace had like shifted to opening a restaurant. So, and then eventually things started to kind of like level out a little bit. And so we hired a guy to come in and kind of take over that role of brewing. And that kind of allowed me to shift into yet another role. So over the course of the last few years, I've had to really I've just had so many different roles, and I've also kind of had this role of kind of like the fill-in guy because I have that brewing background and I know how the brewery and the equipment works. I can always jump back into that. Whereas Doug and Jess, they don't brew commercially, you know what I mean? So they I'm sure that Doug could figure it out. Doug knows beer like the back of his hand, but he's just not
But it's one thing
physical brewer.
Yeah, it's one thing to be a car guy. It's another thing to be a mechanic.
Right,
right. You can know that it's however many cylinders, however many horsepower,
right,
and have it rote. But it's another thing to be able to know where the plug goes. I'm with you on that. And so your role seems very important. But as I look behind you, I don't see like brewery books. So what? Right. So what? I feel like I have a sense of what's coming next. What is this new role?
Yeah. Well, kind of the way this story started was there was a period of time after the production brewery started and was making good beer. It was like rolling smoothly. And I was still brewing at the pub where this was like, it kind of in a lot of ways felt like a flashback to like the beginning days of Burial, where I kind of had like total creative freedom on what I could make. Mm-hmm. I mean, it felt like in a lot of ways, the beer that was brewed there was just kind of filling holes and creating diversity on the tap list. And it could kind of be whatever it wanted to be, whatever I was inspired by. And so this was kind of a interesting path that I ended up walking down that had some positives and some negatives at the end of the day. But I really had always been very fascinated with using kind of botanicals in beer. So another one of those beers that I would call an Epiphany beer for me, though it wasn't necessarily the first beer that I discovered, but it was a very critical beer for me, was a beer made by Jolly Pumpkin called Baudelaire I.O., which is the saison with flowers in it. So it has like hibiscus and chamomile. I'm sure there's some other flowers in it, maybe elderflower. I forget exactly. It's been a while since I've had it, but that beer really kind of blew my mind and like made me think about other contributions to beer that could make it, more complex, that weren't just the standard brewing ingredients. So I started to make a lot of beers with different botanicals, and so that started me walking down this path of just botanical discovery. And so I'd be reading all these herbalism books, and it's kind of weird because I think it's probably a very backwards, roundabout way to discover beverages like vermouth and amaro. But I kind of discovered those beverages through wanting to learn more about herbs and botanicals and stuff. So I kind of just started walking down this path of trying to get my hands on as many amaro and vermouth as I could, and trying to like pick them apart as much as I could. Like, what am I tasting? One of the most fascinating parts about these beverages is that there's like a very long standing tradition of secrecy as it surrounds the production of these. So like, you might be able to read the back of the bottle and discover a handful of the botanicals that are in there, but it'll say, 56 botanicals in this, and
it's a Dr. Pepper recipe,
right. Yeah.
Sugar.
Right. Exactly. So, I think this concept kind of scratched that itch that I've so long had about some of these more like avant-garde musicians that I've loved. Some like ambient or drone albums that are maybe sometimes produced with like synthesizers or sometimes with a laptop, but like when you listen to them, you don't innately know how it was created. It's not like you're like, oh, I hear a guitar, bass, drums, and a saxophone. Like, that makes sense. It's so much more like otherworldly than that. So you have to really dig and to try to figure out like how this was made, like what the process was, what strange instruments were utilized. And so I kind of like secretly love that secrecy part of these, because you really have to like dig deep to get any sort of insight. And then you also have to rely on your own palate a lot. And the more you get your hands on botanicals and actually like play around with them and, like steep them in hot water or a grain spirit or whatever, you start to, okay, like this is what this smells like. I actually recognize that from this Fernet I had. Like, oh shit, like there's constantly these moments of like, okay, things are starting to line up for me here. Sure. And that just, it's funny because it's like pretty much the stark opposite of beer. Because, and don't get me wrong, like I said before, the camaraderie and the sharing and the relationships of beer is what drew me to it in the first place, and is one of the most beautiful parts of it. But it's interesting because when you're a brewer, you can reach out to almost any brewer and be like, hey, could you give me some insight on like how you made that happen? And like, it's quite rare that they'll be like, nah, I'm sorry, that's proprietary information, like, yeah, man, of course, like this is exactly what we did. And so that's super cool. And I think that if it wasn't for that, the overall quality of beer wouldn't be where it is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that sort of like concept does tend to lead to a place where like a lot of people's beers start to taste the same.
Heard. Yeah.
Because everyone's kind of doing, okay, like this way of making a hazy IPA is super successful. We should do that, and whereas if you're trying to make a vermouth and you really don't have much of a starting place, you're more inclined to produce a very unique individual product because it's your own journey. It's your own kind of trial and error.
Yeah.
And I love that about it. So, to get back to visuals.
Visuals.
So Visuals is a brand that we created that has morphed quite a bit since the beginning idea. So Visuals came about, it was a thing that Doug and I wanted to create as a means to kind of like get back to the roots of why we fell in love with beer in the first place. So this is just, I'm incredibly proud of what Burial is and has become. And I think that it's constantly very creative and different. And I love all that, but there is a part of your head. It's like, man, I really love like this type of imagery as an example. Like I wish that we could have cans that looked like this, but it just doesn't fit the brand. You know what I mean? And so, and then there's also that idea of like the business gets to be big enough where you have, a lot of employees to look out for, and it just becomes really complicated where you can't necessarily make decisions based off of whim or, personal enjoyment. It becomes much bigger than that. So this Visuals brand was like, let's keep it niche. Let's, make fun little like single barrel beer projects. We can put beers that just don't really feel like they fit into the Burial lineup over there. We can have different labels. You know what? Let's make the labels like in-house so that we have much more freedom over it. And it kind of, in a lot of ways, initially felt like it was getting back to the homebrew days. It was like small batch, do whatever inspires you in the moment, make a label yourself, and put it out into the world. And we kind of quickly found that burial, forestry camp, all these things we have going on, didn't allow us much freedom or time to actually do this like pet project of ours. So it kind of like sat on the back burner for a little while. There was, months, if not a year plus, that went by where we didn't make a visuals beer. And so we also had this concept initially that we wanted it to be a special forestry camp only line.
Okay.
So we envisioned this thing where people go into forestry camp, they look at the beer list, they see visuals on there, and they're like, oh, I don't even know what that is. Or like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. I kind of forgot about that. Like, we should totally get that. And you kind of feel like you are like in on the secret, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think a lot of that stuff just didn't really play out quite like we thought it would. So then we started we got a license to make wine because a lot of factors went into it. Like I said, when I first met Doug and Jess, they were really, yeah. And like, they never really weren't wine people. And actually Doug kind of was reinvigorated with his passion for wine not that long ago. And he's like amongst the most knowledgeable people I've ever met in my life about wine, which is amazing. So we decided we wanted to start making wine. And another kind of factor that played into that was that we started to go to hop selection every year with this concept where during hop harvest, you go out to the Northwest, you get your hands and your nose on the hops, and you pick the ones you like the best. And those are the ones you contract, and they send them back to you for the rest of the year. And so we realized that a lot of the grapes that we were interested in for wine were coming out of like Oregon and Northern California and some in Washington. So we were like, wonder if we could loop all this together where we're out there selecting hops. It's the same harvest season as grapes. We can buy some grapes and, help with the harvest and ship them back. So we started making wine. We didn't really know how it was going to fit into the greater burial brand. And so then, since we were making wine, I was like, well, I got to make vermouth,
Sure.
Such a great opportunity. And then also in North Carolina, a wine license also allows you to make cider. And we were like, well, we are fortunate enough to live in an area of the country where we've got some pretty great apples. So we can start dabbling in making cider. So eventually the Visuals brand, we kind of were like, okay, Burial can be the beer brand, you know what I mean? Let's just kind of shift Visuals into being this wine and cider and vermouth and possibly other non-beer beverages that we want to make in the future. So now, once I got out of the brewery, post-COVID or like amidst COVID, got out of the brewery, my role kind of shifted into what, my title now is Director of Development. And it's kind of this idea of developing new products, but also developing relationships, which has always been really important to us. And we've really tried to put a lot of effort into developing relationships outside of the beer community, other makers and, growers or what have you. So, but that my kind of main focus right now is Visuals. And so we got a bunch of grapes in a couple months ago. From this year, we got them from Mendocino, so in California. And we got a wine press and bought a bunch of new neutral oak barrels. And so we've been making.
Holy moly!
We have made wine. We have several different products in the works. We actually just released our Nouveau Wine. Yesterday.
Wow! So we could go to Forestry Camp, buy some Visuals.
Yeah.
Wine?
So we actually have. So at our at both Forestry Camp and at the Burial Tap Room, we have 2 wines that were from the previous harvest year that are available. Also 2 vermouths, a sweet and a dry vermouth. So we have 4 products.
Holy moly!
That are currently available. If you ask for them at either location, they have them for you. And then the Nouveau Wine is just really cool kind of concept of basically putting out an extremely young wine. So this is 2020 vintage.
Yeah.
We're literally talking 2 months since we got the grapes in, and it's in a bottle. So it's, not barrel aged at all. And you don't have that tannin structure from the wood. So it's just really lush and fruity. And it's a really cool kind of insight. As I've been saying, it's insight into what this harvest year is like.
I feel like that's a marketer's creation. How do we get this? How do we sell something immediately? Right. Nouveau Wine is a nouveau rage, I suspect, but that's awesome. Now knowing that this is a thing, I knew that it was a work in progress. I didn't know where we stood on the timeline, and I'll call it my own lack of doing homework. But I want to attempt to transition from history to future. So we're nearing the end of 2020. I don't know exactly when this episode's going to come out. It might be early 2021, early days of next year, knowing that we've just lived through a year that is absolutely unheard of. And I guess it's always been true that you can't be sure what the future holds. What is in store across the 3 brands and business verticals? I know that as director of development, Visuals is core. What should we expect from Visuals early 2021?
Well, we've been putting out cider. So we're making natural cider, which is something that I became pretty passionate about extremely recently. It was actually something that came out of opening Forestry Camp, because Forestry Camp's kind of initial inspiration was Basque cuisine.
Yeah.
So, this, kind of area of Spain that kind of goes into France. Basically has its own language, its own culture in a lot of ways. And so through doing a lot of research on the Basque region and the cuisine of that area, I discovered Basque cider, which is just really beautiful. It's basically taking the natural wine concept and applying it to apples. And really it's interesting to me because cider in America, I feel like is by most people is kind of viewed as this beer substitute, where it should have the same sort of price point as beer. It should be kind of consumed in a similar way. Whereas really in a lot of other parts of the world, and if you think about apples being a fruit like wine grapes are a fruit, cider is considered to be more of a wine in a lot of other places, and treated as such, and often aged for a whole year and vintaged like wine is and all that stuff. But essentially the idea is that whatever natural yeast and bacteria lives on the fruit is what ferments it. So you get this kind of funky, tart, very earthy, sometimes floral. In a lot of ways, I think it's congruent to the farmhouse and saison concept. And I get a lot of similar sensory experiences out of it, where it's often very dry. It's a little funky. It's a little tart. It's got that fruity element to it. In some cases, it's quite effervescent, like those beer styles are. Not always, but so anyway, we've been actively making those. We've released one at the tap room as a draft only from this harvest year so far, but we've got several more in the works. Working on new vermouth products. I'm working on hoping to make some bitters products. Some kind of like spritz sort of things, like a wine spritz sort of thing. Also, I'm doing a lot of research and development around like some non-alcoholic beverages. So kind of in the like aperitif, digestif sort of world, but non-alcoholic. So kind of like a cocktail inspired non-alcoholic thing.
Holy moly. So the sky's the limit, and you can go as wide as you want when the visuals brand. I am very excited to see what results, if you need, I wouldn't call it quality control. My palate is not sophisticated like that, but I could definitely give you a poor man's take on what I'm experiencing. I look forward to seeing that. I want to ask a question though that is tangential, and you pointed towards it earlier, which is relationships. We're going to transition quickly into a little bit of a Asheville focused speed round to close out this conversation. But you mentioned how like beer and relationships, and one of the questions that I thought was that led to interesting insight was like choosing Asheville despite being, Beer City, USA, to build a beer place. And then the fact that there aren't many secrets in beer. When you think of Asheville and community, like what shows up for you?
Oh man, there's so much. I mean, the beer side in it of itself is obviously, kind of square one for us. We have pretty good relationships with almost every brewery in town or in the area. And, we've collaborated in some way, shape, or form with almost all of them. And, one of the coolest parts about the Asheville community is like, we can always kind of lean on each other, and people are always very happy to help. So obviously, like I mentioned, information is a good example of that. But like, say you were shorted a bag of, oats, and you really need oats for tomorrow's brew. I've got so many breweries that I could reach out to and be like, hey, can I borrow an extra bag of oats from you? And like, most likely I'll find one before the brew day tomorrow. Wow. And like, that's a beautiful thing. I think that through running the brewery and through doing a lot of collaboration has always been a huge part of who we are. And we love to host collaborators. We've had the fortune of being able to travel a ton for the brewery, and we've made relationships all over the country and really all over the world. And so collaboration becomes this really great way of like getting together with your friends. Like a lot of ways making a beer is just like an ancillary benefit to getting to hang out with your friends. And so we're really proud of Asheville. We think it's really fucking cool. We think we have a lot to offer. It's a beautiful place. And so we love to host collaborators and bring them into Asheville and like just really take care of them. And kind of through doing that, through the years, we've developed a lot of great relationships with restaurant owners and bar owners and other businesses. And so there's a lot of camaraderie there as well. And, it's just, we've made attempts to expand our kind of collaborative spirit to things outside of beer that maybe don't make any sense on the surface to collaborate with a brewery, but like things like the Asheville Art Museum or the Asheville Symphony, or French Broad Chocolates is, maybe not too far of a stretch. We have a pretty cool relationship with Harvest Records, where we like play all vinyl at forestry camp. So we kind of worked a deal with them, and a lot of times when collaborators come into town, we'll take them to Harvest Records and we'll be like, hey, I'll buy you, or like, I'll pay for a record, you pick it out, and it'll be your contribution to the vinyl library at forestry camp. So like every time we play that record, that's kind of like your imprint on it. Lots of little things like that. We just worked with Al Bakery just this past week. Susanna and the crew made a bunch of pastries, croissants that we actually added to a beer.
Wow.
Yeah. And lots of little things like that, and then also like the whole vendor, for lack of a better word, side of things, especially as we've started a restaurant, has been huge. So like forestry camp's whole like philosophy is very much about like supporting other local makers, growers. We have this whole animal program where we get in, obviously like whole chickens and fish, but whole pigs, like quarter or half cows, and we butcher them all ourselves. And so we're getting all these products from local-ish, at least, in the Carolinas, or even like seafood. We made a relationship with Local Seafood, which is out in Raleigh, and they get seafood from the coast every day. And we have a tap room in Raleigh, so we're sending beer there all the time. So we have a truck there. So we're like, hey, can we pick up some seafood from you guys while we're in Raleigh and bring it back for forestry camp? So there's so many things like that. Asheville is such at the end of the day, like you kind of hinted at earlier, it's a pretty small city, you know what I mean? And like you live here long enough, and as long as you have an interest in other creative people, and what they're all about, then and you just inquire and you say hi, people are really open and excited to meet other people in the community, and it's great. I guess if you're the type of person that hates to go to the grocery store and be seen and have to talk to somebody, which, I think all of us are there at times.
Yeah.
It can be challenging, but I've always said that if I had to pinpoint like the number one best part about Asheville, it's the people, it's the people, and it's so cool to me that almost everybody I meet that lives in Asheville has some sort of like interesting hobby. It feels like, even if I initially meet this person because they're like a banker, or
lawyer,
something like that.
Whatever.
Yeah, like it could be anything that's seemingly mundane on its surface, but the more you get to know them, you find out that they, are a potter in their free time.
Raise bees, have like a crazy beehive in their backyard. I completely agree. That is, and what I've found, Sarah and I have found, is that if you show curiosity and like genuine interest, there is a very warm welcoming that almost everyone will provide to say like, yeah, come check out my thing. Like come look at this beehive. Come, like, this is how we brew. And I hear here on favorite thing about Asheville are its people. Last question of this podcast is is a staple of the podcast, and it is a magic wand question. So to you today, Tim, if I had a magic wand, or anyone in the audience had a magic wand and could grant you a single wish, what would that wish be today?
Well, I think that one thing that I've thought immensely about over the course of 2020, with all the crazy things that have happened, and the political climate and the social climate, but also something that has come out of being a business owner, a business that has, like 70 plus employees. I think so much more about people and relationships and how to speak to people. And I think that especially something that for me seemed to really come out of the social political climate of 2020 was this kind of concept of like showing compassion and empathy for others. I feel like, so I guess I would use the magic wand to instill a certain level of passion, or compassion, I should say, and empathy to everyone, and to kind of just stop feeling so inclusive about who you care about and who you think matters. And I think to some people that is a pretty small bubble, and I think a lot of people don't really consider the challenges of other people outside of their bubble, and that not everyone thinks like you, and not everyone has the opportunities that you have. And I think if everybody were to, it's such a classic concept of putting yourself in other people's shoes. And I think if people did that more often and really thought, hey, even though I don't know that person whatsoever, what can I garner from what concept can I get out of like what they're dealing with, and can I have some understanding and some empathy for their position? So
I love that. And that is as close to my answer these days as possible. And I think the issue most people, when they attempt to hop in the other person's shoes, it's like a single moment in time. Well, if I were them, I wouldn't have done that thing. I wouldn't have said that thing, but that forgets the entire lived experience of that person, and it omits the difference between yours and theirs. And so, like, no, that if you were them, you would do exactly the thing because they've experienced exactly what they've experienced, and it's different than yours. What a crazy opportunity it would be to really spend time in that level of like awareness of the other, and I think it's a very astute request from the universe and community at large.
It's one of those things that I so often wish that aliens would attack Earth.
So there's a single enemy.
So that Earth is like on the same team for once. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that would change everything for the way that we operate and the way that we deal with each other.
I think that you are right. I don't want aliens to exist. I just want that outcome. Or at least aliens can exist. Don't attack us, aliens, if you're listening. But Tim, I'll try and recap my emotions and thoughts on this conversation. I'm so, and I hope that if a listener makes it this far into the conversation, they feel it as well. Like, amazed at the ability to create and like continue to try new things and do new things, and the success that you've had through Burial and being a staple in this community, at least to the newcomers like Sarah and myself, is aspirational. And so thank you for making time this morning, and I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, so did I, man. It was awesome. Like I said at the beginning, I'm thankful that you guys do this and, take so much time and put so much effort forth to tell people's stories. And yeah, obviously it's fun. It's fun, I guess, to talk about myself as much as it's kind of awkward. But like, it's been amazing to get to listen to a lot of the the backlog of podcasts that you guys have done. You've talked to so many cool people, and I also want to thank you for having my wife.
I know,
on.
so I can't believe I was trying to find a spot the whole time.
Yeah.
This is the first time that the same last name has shown up in multiple episodes, and it's been a privilege. You guys are really exceptional. Sarah and I, romantically aspire to be as cool as you two one day, and to see your farm and your chickens.
I think you're there for sure. But yeah, I appreciate that. That's kind of you. And like I kind of imagined that we'd talk a little bit more about maybe some things that inspire me. And I would definitely be remiss to not mention how much Annalise, my wife, inspires me all the time. She's incredibly passionate and creative about what she does, and she definitely doesn't get as much credit as she deserves of ideas that she tosses my way that end up coming to fruition at Burial.
I love it. Her episode, I am not as good at episode numbers as Sarah, but late 60s, early 70s on the Making It in Asheville podcast, Spoon and Hook, Annalise Gormley episode was absolutely fantastic. This one was as well. And so as a final question, how might people find you on the World Wide Web if they wanted to support, reach out, follow along?
Yeah, sure. I guess like most people, Instagram is kind of what we're using most to promote our businesses. So we're just at Burial Beer, at Forestry Camp, at Drink Visuals. We also have Burial DTR, which is our Raleigh tap room for Burial. It's burialbeer.com. It's forestrycamp.com. It's drinkvisuals.com. We have so many things.
That was the best. That was the best rundown of links. We'll have them all in the show notes page on this episode. But awesome. Most people are like, I think we have a website. So that was a wonderful job gathering all those links and remembering them off the top of your head. Tim, thank you so much again for your time this morning.
Yeah, happy to be part of it. Thank you.